Most AI discussions focus on its risks to democracy: disinformation, surveillance, centralization of power. But what if AI could make governance better? Glen Weyl, political economist at Microsoft Research and founder of RadicalxChange, argues that AI could be used to create more participatory, decentralized, and democratic systems if we design it right. In this guest lecture, he joins Beatrice Erkers in conversation to explore what AI governance could look like if we tried to use it for real pluralism.
I'm very excited to be here with Glen Weyl. Thanks for joining us, Glen.
My pleasure to be here with you, Beatrice.
Thank you. Would you like to maybe just introduce yourself and talk about the work that you're doing? I think especially at RadicalxChange, it would be very interesting to hear about.
Great. I have a background as an economist. I used to be a professor at the University of Chicago, but I've drifted into trying to take as ambitious of an approach to redesigning social, political, economic institutions as we take to our technologies. And so that's taken me away from traditional economics into the intersection of economics, sociology, political science, computer science, all those things. I work a lot at the intersection between AI, crypto, and those types of disciplinary thinking. And I work in a variety of different sectors. I do cultural work on imagining the future. I do research. I do technology deployment. I work with governments around the world. And I've devoted a lot of attention to telling the story of Taiwan and Audrey Tang, their digital minister, who has done, in my view, the most exciting work in the world on that kind of social innovation. This is the book that we wrote together. It's the first fully open source, democratically governed book ever. And we made a film about her life, many other things, all telling the story of how we can harness technology, not just to make cool tools, but to make a different type of social fabric.
Thank you. I think that's a great intro. So when you think about the future with AI and how AI is currently advancing, what do you see? What do you think is coming, and what do you think we should be doing about it now?
So I think that the term AI is quite confusing and misleading because it refers to the human constructed independent vision of the system. We don't usually think of capitalism or a corporation as an AI because people are part of the system. And I think that's a much better way of understanding what is coming or what we have the potential to create than is the notion of an autonomous agentic intelligence. And I think that's important because it just makes the whole system work better. If you think about an artificial intelligence system, it's trained by feeding in data and then having some kind of reward or outcome. And then based on the associations between the data and the outcome, the model learns. But the data are created by people for the most part. And those people have inside their minds neural networks. So really, the feeding of data into the system is really one sub-neural network of the broader global neural network connecting to another subpart of that global neural network. And if we neglect the connections between the artificial substrates and the human substrates, we waste a huge amount of the computational capacity. And so really what the project here is not one of creating an autonomous external artificial intelligence, but strengthening the fabric that connects the silicon and the organic to make an overall stronger system.
And how do you think we can do that? Like, where do we even start?
At a very technical level, we can extend the things that we do to train models internally to have the models indicate the humans that contributed to them and that deserve both economic rewards and a voice in shaping those systems. We can teach people to be more aware of what's going on within the systems. We can build user interfaces that give people that awareness. We can create more creative, rich, democratic systems that enable people to understand what's going on and to participate more meaningfully in shaping these more complex systems. and we can take the economic benefits that are coming from selling these models and give those to the people who are creating all that value. So in all these ways, by both raising the sort of level of understanding and education of the people participating in the systems, and by rewarding them for that, we can create an overall sort of cybernetic system in which the people are participants that performs much better than an independent, autonomous, silicon-based system.
And I know you've worked at quite a few concrete examples of how we could maybe better distribute ownership of data or distribute just like the benefits of currently the AI developments. Do you want to dive into any of those?
Yeah, I'll give you an example of a paper I just released, and it's a little bit less focused on the economic and a little bit more on the social aspect, but I think it's very concrete, and so hopefully it'll give you an illustration. Right now, many people use large social media platforms for cultural reasons like TikTok, or for news reasons like X and Blue Sky, or for productivity reasons like LinkedIn and GitHub and so forth. These systems use data that comes from the social fabric, from our relationship to each other, from how we interact with the content that each other produces, to output new patterns, new suggestions of what we might want to consume. So it replaces centralized gatekeepers with data from that social fabric with some kind of a network model. But often that's not transparent. We just get a For You feed, which shows us the things that it thinks we will like. But it doesn't, and it does that on the basis of the social relationships and groups that we're a part of. But it doesn't make that transparent to us. It doesn't show us where we're sitting on. And we proposed this idea in a paper called Pro-Social Media with a number of collaborators, including Audrey Tong, that we would label the content by the social group that you're a part of, in which that content is consensual. And that is the reason why you're receiving that content. And that would help make people aware of the internal operations of the system. It would help make them aware of the different social groups that they're a part of, make them socially self-aware of the social system in which they're operating. So that's just one illustration of what I think it means to build systems that help people understand the system itself and their place in it so that they can meaningfully participate in that system.
What do you think are currently like the biggest blockers to seeing more of these sort of innovative governance models happen? And how do you think we can overcome the blockers?
I think the biggest blockers are fundamentally about the human mind, about the complexity that we can grapple with, about our cultural imagination, which sees technology and politics and society as completely separate. Technology is hard and fast and governed by its own logic, and politics is squishy and stuck and whatever. And we need to bring those two together, because our technology can only advance most effectively if we advance along with it, if our understanding of the world, if our participation advances along with it. And that's not how most people, at least in the West, think about things. So I think it's that cultural gap. It's that feeling of helplessness. It's that feeling that the times are getting away from us and that we don't have a participation or agency in them that is the biggest barrier. And so ultimately, I think the most important solutions are often cultural, which is why I do so much cultural work as well as technical work.
And when you do cultural work, do you find that it's best to just like, you go out and talk about this, or what? Because part of this course, for example, is world building, and that we're trying to get people to literally envision what a positive future with AI in 2035 could look like. What do you find are like the best tools to actually?
I think that mass market is absolutely critical, because when you have to describe a vision of the future to a very large number of people and get them to actually want to consume it, you have to come up with a vision that is basically democratic, because otherwise people won't want to consume it. I think there's a very strong correlation between the best visions of the futures and the one that reach the broadest audience. And the ones that reach very narrow audiences tend to be very elitist and anti-democratic. I think that Epcot, the amusement park at Disney, and Star Trek, those are probably the two broadest market visions of the future that have ever existed. I think those are two of the best examples because they were disciplined by the need to appeal to such broad audiences. And I would love to see more things like that. Japan's Mirai-Con Museum, their Museum of Emerging Technology and Innovation, is not quite at that same scale, but is another example that I think is really spectacular. And I'm hopeful for this new Star Trek that's been coming out in the last few years that will play a valuable role. I hope we can bring back, Epcot has drifted away from thinking about the future, but I hope we could build a new Epcot or something like that. I think that would be a huge contribution to the future of humanity.
Yeah. I was not familiar with the Japanese museum. Is that in Tokyo or?
Yes, it is. It's one of my favorite places in the world. I'm going to Tokyo in a couple of months and I'll visit there again.
Great. I guess take pictures. Yeah, I think so. Basically, it sounds like you're saying a bit tap into Hollywood or like tap into the sort of the culture that we're all consuming or most of us are consuming on an everyday basis.
Yeah, as I said, the really, I think, negative visions of the future that have become dominant, like Snow Crash, I think, frankly, some of the things from Asimov and so forth, I know these are very popular in tech circles, but I think that they're very problematic. And I think the reason that we've ended up with these is because they only sell to a very limited audience. And certain types of tech geeks could like this, but there's something that would never appeal to a broad public. And if you're forced to spell out visions of the future that also must speak to a broad public, then you end up with a very democratic vision. So I'm a big believer in ambitious, broad market-oriented, protopian content.
And do you believe that the visions are popular with that are popular with maybe like the tech elite more are popular because they are more like edgy or like intellectually edgy? And that's
I think that they're intellectually edgy, they're provocative, they often have a very small group of people who is dominant, and most people in the tech elite can imagine that they become one of those people. So
yeah, very interesting. So I think let's dive into that a little bit, because currently one of the things that the purpose of this course is to engage more like social innovators and people with the question of like how to distribute the power of AI, because it's coming and there's both like the economic just benefits, like how do we distribute those, but also the tools and the knowledge. And yeah, what do you think? I know you've written a lot about pluralism, for example, like how can we use more maybe pluralistic decision-making in AI governance? And
I think it's absolutely critical that we not be seduced by the siren song of just distributing economic benefits, because the economy, as it's usually considered, focuses on the availability of private goods. But almost everything we consume is not a private good. And the more we move to an information age, the less private goods there will be. The things that really affect us, that really make a difference in our life, is not what we consume, but the things that we share. I live on a lake. This is a very old-fashioned public good. But you could enclose the lake that I live on and give us each a little bit bigger yard. And that would be, I think, at least for me, and I think for many other people, far worse outcome than leaving the lake there. Because the lake gives this shared benefit to all the people around us. The cuisines that we consume, yes, the individual calories are a private good, but the cultural knowledge that creates the combination of flavors, the chefs that serve a community, these are all shared goods. And the more we move into an information age, the less there is of those scarce private goods and the more there are of those shared goods. And so if we centralize and give to an AI or a small set of engineers control over the shape of the culture and the public goods that we consume, and then we distribute evenly the scarce private goods, effectively, we will have taken something we've already eliminated the problem of and give that to everyone, so give them nothing, basically. And we'll give all the power to a very small set of people. And that's the opposite of egalitarianism or distribution or participation. It has that superficial look to it, but in reality, it concentrates all the control. So what we need to focus on is how do we give dignity and agency and participation to actually shape the future that we have through technology. rather than distributing economic benefits. And that's a very old idea. It's actually J.C.R. Licklider, the founder of the internet, in an essay in 1979, his last line was, we must ensure that not only does technology serve the public interest, but rather it serves the interest of the public having a voice in the technologies that will determine its future.
Do you think we're on track with that, or how do you think it's going?
I think that we have a terrible divide in our society. Technologists are entirely focused on like visions of the future that centralize control, whether they be in an accelerationist vision where just like the strongest alpha male takes over and runs everything. And we're seeing that play out in US government a lot right now, or highly technocratic ones where we've got to manage and control risk, and it's got to be controlled by the people who know and understand, and everybody else just gets income. And both of those are antithetical to the vision I'm talking about. They both stand in the way of people genuinely participating. I think we need to take a much more pluralistic, humane vision in which people are brought along with the advances in technology and have agency and participation. And that's something that I think many people will be sympathetic to, but that is not in the vision of the tech world now, because a lot of these sort of broadly shared cultural things fell apart. Not in Asia. In Asia, I think it's much better. I think in Japan, in India, in Taiwan, you see this, but you don't see it in the West. And so I think we need to bridge that divide.
Is there anything where you see that we've talked quite a bit about the challenges of AI, but where this sort of guest lecture comes into our course is where we've gone through like the different possibilities of several technologies.
Yeah.
And your work falls into the bucket that we call social technologies.
Yeah.
And so do you think that there are ways where it could actually help us really enhance democracy? And
absolutely. AI is in some sense just a version of democracy. When we think of democracy, the first thing we think of is voting. Voting is you add up a bunch of people's inputs and then you make a decision based on that. And then I've developed more sophisticated forms of voting where you can say how important something is to you, and we add that up and make a decision. And then there are more sophisticated ways where we take into account, here are different social groups, and we don't want one to just dominate the other. So if only they're supporting something, then it can't get passed. We need like support across different groups. And then you can go to even more sophisticated things where we're like taking into account the sort of different inputs that people have to a process. And all AI really is that a bunch of data comes in, and then there's a bunch of voting, and then a bunch of voting. And that's all that AI really is. It's actually a form of democratic participation. It's just obscured. It's treated like it's this autonomous machine, when in fact, it's like the voting of a bunch of voting of a bunch of voting of a bunch of voting. It's some really sophisticated democratic system. The problem is we don't have self-awareness of that. We don't have understanding of what's going on. And so it seems like this opaque and external thing. So I think inherently in its structure, AI is trying to be exactly that kind of democratic mechanism. It's just that we use words like AI that make it seem like it's some external agent. Rather, I'd prefer to say cooperative intelligence or democratic intelligence or something like that, collective intelligence.
Collective intelligence seems like, yeah, that sort of captures it really well. I think that one of the last questions I want to ask you is just, we in this course talk about this division of tool AI versus AGI, ASI, where tool AI is more something that can help us enhance our agency in different fields, whereas AGI is like artificial general intelligence. It's more something where we don't really know what that would even look like at this point. Do you have any... I think I can guess that your preference is more towards like tool AI based on our conversation here, but do you have any thoughts on like how can we...
I like the term tool AI either, because are capitalism and corporations tools? There are broader systems in which we all sit that have changed the fabric of our lives, but that are constituted of us. So that's how I think of these things. I don't think of them as just like some concrete tool that we use. I think of them as systems that we are a part of and that are a part of us and that create a social fabric. And I don't particularly like the cyborg imagination either, because again, that's very individual. I'm just enhancing my capabilities. What to me is really interesting about this is these things as a fabric that brings us all together. And I think a wonderful movie that represents this is the one called The Wild Robot. It came out in the fall, and it's one of my favorite children's pieces of content ever. And it's about how a robot that was meant to be following human orders, to be aligned, so to speak, goes off and starts doing crazy things like raising a gosling and working with different animals to protect them from environmental degradation. So it goes off and gets unaligned, right? It ends up just doing its own thing. And yet actually what it does is much richer and more humane than the alignment that people are trying to do. And to me, that is what it's about. Like, we don't want things to just follow orders, even our true intention. But we also don't want them to take over and dominate everything. We want them to be a fabric that connects us, that elevates us, that brings us together in ways that we couldn't imagine, and that helps us see different possibilities. You don't need control to be humane. You need connection. You need respect. You need integration. And that's, I think, what we should aspire to much more. Not to use and enslave and make a tool, not to make some idol that dominates us all, but to make something new that brings us together in ways we couldn't imagine.
Yeah, I loved The Wild Robot as well. I thought it was, the movie was amazing, and the book is also
I haven't
amazing.
read the book. I should, yeah.
It was really good, very poetic. But also, yes, I love that vision of just, because I discussed it with a few people and people had different reactions to it, where some people were like, no, but it was unaligned. Like, it was an unaligned AI, basically. But I was very inspired by it because I felt that it was this vision of technology and nature merging that I hadn't seen before, where I feel like oftentimes technology and nature are like presented as enemies to one another, or like in a constant battle or something. Whereas I thought this was interesting because I felt like it showed that technology could help us be closer to nature and be like better versions of ourselves.
I mean, this is very Japanese. In Japan, the reason why there's not this whole fight over AI or obsession with AGI or whatever is that people believe in the Shinto tradition that everything has a spirit. And so the notion that a computer would have a spirit is obvious. And the notion that a computer could help other things express their spirit is very exciting. And so that's the vision I think is much more appealing than many of the binary visions about is it AGI or not that infect the Western discourse.
Yeah, that's a very interesting perspective to bring in. That, yeah, I'm not very familiar with it, but I think we'll have to read up on it. I wanted to ask you basically also, before we round off, just like if you could point course participants to a few of your like favorite resources or readings on what we've talked about today, what would that be? And I think what would be really interesting is just a few of your like proposals on how we could do this better. Like, how can we?
There's this book, which has lots of stuff. It's freely available at plurality.net. There is a new paper that we put out called Pro-Social Media, which is available on Archive, and that has a more detailed proposal on the particular social media idea that I told you about. There is a wonderful book called The Dream Machine about J.C.R. Licklider's career building the internet. And that's a wonderful historical illustration and example. In Japanese, there's an amazing book called The Namaraka Society and Its Enemies, which anticipates most of the ideas in our book by about a decade and is very famous in Japan, but was never translated to English. But it just shows how deep these types of thinking are in Japanese culture. And we have a film that the trailer is out right now called Good Enough Ancestor. By the time this goes out to your audience, the film will probably be available online. It's coming out in 5 days.
Wow, that sounds amazing.
It's 20 minutes long. It's a short documentary.
Great. A very cool title as well. Good Enough Ancestor.
Yeah.
Well,
you don't want to be too good of an ancestor, because then you actually reduce the freedom of your future generations. They feel the need to do exactly what you foresaw. You just want to be good enough to not wipe out their future. So it's actually better to just be okay, to be a satisfying ancestor, basically.
That takes the load off our shoulders. We just want to, yeah.
Don't do so well that they feel the need to follow you mindlessly.
That's a very nice perspective. I've never thought of it that way. Thank you so much, Glenn, for taking the time. And thanks for your work and recommending these resources. I think, yeah, they're going to be really good.
Live long and prosper.
Live long and prosper.